Hello, I'm Lydia Talbot. Welcome to Sanctuary. For nearly 2,000 years, Christian faithful have retraced the steps of Jesus in his final hours before crucifixion. Known as the Stations of the Cross, the practice is celebrated here in Chicago and around the world in church architecture, vivid passion reenactments, and most traditionally in the Holy Land itself, along the Via Dolorosa, or Way of Suffering, in Jerusalem. Join us as we journey to the Holy Land to trace the traditional steps of Jesus as recounted in the biblical narrative, from his arrest to crucifixion in the Stations of the Cross, today on Sanctuary.
Hello, I'm Pastor Eric Schaefer. Pilgrims from around the world have visited Jerusalem for centuries, since the area includes some of the holiest sites for Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, as well as the Baha'i faith. For Christians, the focus of visits to Jerusalem has often been the Via Dolorosa, literally the Way of Sorrow, tracing Jesus' last days before his crucifixion and death, a route which stretches from the Hall of Pilate part of the Roman fortress of Antonio, now part of the Ecce Homo convent, where Jesus was condemned, to Golgotha, Calvary, where he was executed and buried, now both under the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Over time, certain points or stations became associated with specific events recounted or implied in the Gospels. Pilgrims use these stations for prayer and meditation. They continue to be popular year-round in Jerusalem, but of course are most crowded during Holy Week, and especially on Good Friday. Some pilgrims even carry wooden crosses, large and small, as they visit these sites. Eventually, these points evolved into 14 individual Stations of the Cross, points for prayer and meditation, with some even including small chapels for prayer. We will visit each of the stations and hear the biblical text associated with them. If you are a Roman Catholic or Orthodox background, the Stations of the Cross are most likely pretty familiar. Most Roman Catholic churches include the Stations of the Cross somewhere in their architecture. In some churches, there are as few as 8 stations, focusing on 8 specific gospel events, and in some, as many as 15, adding a final station for Jesus' resurrection. Personally, I find the Stations of the Cross helpful in my own personal prayer and meditation. By focusing on the specific events of Jesus' final days before his death on the cross, we can find help for the painful parts of our own lives when we too are in the valley of the shadow of death, to quote the 23rd Psalm. By focusing on the darkness of Jesus' last days, I believe we can more appreciate Jesus' resurrection on Easter and the light that Jesus can continue to bring into our lives and the lives of others, no matter how dark the journey. So, let's take a walk, a journey if you will, along the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, the Stations of the Cross.
Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray, that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak."
For the first station, we're here on the Mount of Olives, among the olive trees, the traditional site of the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus has had a long evening. First, he celebrates the Passover, the Jewish holiday remembering their liberation from slavery in Egypt, with his disciples. During this meal, Jesus establishes the Eucharist, Holy Communion, and identifies Judas as the one who will betray him. There was good food and drink and singing. After dinner, they all leave the city and head up the Mount of Olives, where Jesus calls out Peter, predicting Peter's later denial of Jesus. This is also where tradition tells us the Garden of Gethsemane is located, which is our first station of the cross. Leaving the other disciples behind, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to another part of the garden. Then he goes off to another area to pray alone. As Jesus returns to his three friends, he finds them all asleep, perhaps not surprising with all the food and drink and walking. Clearly upset that his friends could not stay awake for the short time he was away, Jesus utters his famous words, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak."
Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him.
While still in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus returns to Peter, James, and John, who he has left briefly for private prayer, and finds them all asleep. He calls them out. But before Jesus and James and John can respond to Jesus' anger, Judas arrives with a crowd armed with swords and clubs. This is not a random group, but one that comes from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, who we know are out to get Jesus any way they can. Judas identifies Jesus to the evil crowd with a greeting and a kiss, normally a friendly gesture in Jesus' time, but we know it is the kiss of death for Jesus. The crowd grabs Jesus and arrests him.
When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips."
Now we're in the old city of Jerusalem, and we're standing on the Via Dolorosa, literally the way of sorrow. This is the path of the Stations of the Cross by tradition, the path that Jesus followed from his capture through his crucifixion and death. The third station is Jesus condemned by the Sanhedrin. Think of it. Jesus has been up all night, probably. He's been captured, beaten, tortured, condemned, and now he's hauled before the Sanhedrin, and they're trying to get him to admit that he is the Son of God. He won't do it. The Sanhedrin's goal seems to be to get Jesus to admit that he is the Messiah. Because if he admits that he's the Messiah, they have a case to take to the Roman rulers to get Jesus crucified. Because, of course, a claim to be a Messiah, a king on earth, would be to break the Roman rule. But Jesus isn't doing anything other than quoting the Old Testament. Before the Sanhedrin, Jesus has admitted nothing. The Sanhedrin really don't have a case. They will have to find another way to get Jesus crucified.
Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him and said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
This is the 4th station. Peter denies Jesus, and not once but 3 times, as St. Matthew records it. Jesus predicted it. Peter denied it would happen, but it happened. While Jesus is standing tall in front of Caiaphas, Peter in the courtyard outside of where Jesus is being tried is standing low in front of 2 servant girls and a bystander. 3 times he denies that he knows Jesus. Then the rooster crows. Peter realizes what he has done, and he weeps bitterly.
As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
There are several versions of the Stations of the Cross. In this more modern biblical version of the Stations of the Cross, which we're following, this is station number 5, the place where Pontius Pilate condemned Jesus to death. By tradition, we're here in the Old City in a place that historians believe was probably the palace of Pontius Pilate, the fortress of Antonio in Roman times. Today, it is a Franciscan monastery with 2 churches. Behind me, the Church of the Flagellation. Ahead of me, the Church of the Condemnation. The chief priests, the elders, and the scribes have now hauled Jesus here before Pilate to be judged by him. Pilate has no love for either the Jews or Jesus. He just liked to get Jesus out of his face. So bowing to crowd pressure which was stirred up, the text tells us, by the chief priests, Pilate releases Barabbas, whips Jesus, and sends Jesus off to be crucified.
Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and striking him on the face.
In Matthew and Mark's Gospel, this scene takes place after Jesus has been condemned to death by Pilate. In John's Gospel, the text for our 6th station today, this scene takes place in the middle of Jesus' trial in front of Pilate. Some scholars surmise that perhaps John wanted to have Pilate give the Jews a chance to release Jesus. Perhaps a beating will be seen as enough, and Jesus will not have to be executed. However, the weakness of this argument is that there were no Jewish witnesses to Jesus whipping, just Roman soldiers. Rather, John may be using this brief passage to show that Jesus is the King of the Jews. And John as Jesus remain in his purple robe for the remainder of his trial. Jesus is our Lord and King.
When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha.
The seventh station. The crowd is gone. It's just Jesus, Pilate, the chief priests, and the police. No matter. "Crucify him" rings out anyway. Pilate tries to pass Jesus back to the chief priests. They have none of it. Pilate mocks them. They come back with words that catch Pilate. The emperor is their only king. If Pilate liked or cared for Jesus, he might have felt backed into a corner. But Pilate dislikes all the Jews and Jesus too. So in disgust, you can almost hear Pilate saying, "Get me out of here." Pilate turns Jesus over to the chief priests and soldiers to be crucified. Jesus drags his cross to the place of the skull, Golgotha in Hebrew. We often picture in our mind that the place of Jesus' crucifixion was far away, but good scholarship and research suggests that the location for Jesus' crucifixion and burial were both under what is now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, here in the Old City of Jerusalem.
They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus.
The eighth station. Jesus is helped to carry the cross by Simon the Cyrenian. Mark, writing the first and believed most historic of the Gospel, seems to write as if his readers would know who Simon and his sons Alexander and Rufus were, and perhaps they were familiar to the Jerusalem community. Mark appears to be making a double point, that Simon is literally picked out of the crowd by the Roman soldiers, and thus can represent any of us, and that Jesus has been so weakened by beating and abuse that he can no longer carry the cross himself, and even clear to the Roman soldiers, needs help to get to Golgotha.
A great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
The ninth station. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. Here we seem to be making a stop along the way. A stop long enough for Jesus to interact with the crowd and do a bit of teaching. Luke tells us that this crowd is made up of both women and men. They are perhaps the same people who hours earlier called out for Jesus' death. Now they are crying out, lamenting Jesus' coming death. In Jesus' day, it was normal, even expected, to express sorrow publicly by beating breasts and wailing. So Luke tells us how it happened with and for Jesus. Keep in mind that Luke wrote this gospel after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple there. Jesus' words in response to this crowd appear to be a prediction of that destruction, language full of metaphors, but clearly predicting this later tragedy, which would be so bad that it might be better for women to have never even borne children. God's judgment is coming to Jerusalem, and those who are now sending Jesus to his death should be fearful.
When they came to the place that is called the skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing.
Now we're at station 10 of the Stations of the Cross. As a matter of fact, we'll be in this area for the remaining stations, because this area encompasses the rest of the story: Jesus' crucifixion, his tomb, and his resurrection. Over my shoulder, you can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And even though we sometimes think of those three, his crucifixion, tomb, and resurrection, as being far apart, they're actually all within this rather large church. Luke calls the place where Jesus is crucified the skull. That probably referred to the shape of the hill on which Jesus was executed. Other gospel writers call it the place of the skull, or Golgotha. Luke records Jesus' famous last words: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Well, most scholars agree that Jesus did actually say these words. And Luke, well, Luke's pretty clear. Jesus is forgiving those who have killed him. Of course, the soldiers appear not to have heard what Jesus said. They strip Jesus and they take Jesus' clothing for themselves.
One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
This is the 11th station. Jesus promises the kingdom of God to the good thief. Throughout Jesus' life and ministry, he spoke often of forgiveness, and he spoke often of a special concern for the poor and the powerless. Think of the heavenly banquet, open to all, with a special invitation for those who have nothing. Or think of Lazarus, who died poor by the rich man's gate, who enjoyed heavenly paradise.
Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home.
The 12th station. Jesus speaks from the cross to his mother and John. All of the gospel writers place women in this story, but only John places Jesus' mother there, and only John puts the women there before the crucifixion and close by. However, there's more going on here than just Jesus caring for his mother and friend, making sure that they watch out, that is, love for each other after Jesus' death. Scholars believe that this passage is a tie, perhaps the tie, between Jesus' earthly ministry, represented by his mother Mary, and the ministry of the church after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, represented by John. Scholars believe that this text is also announcing a, quote, new family of God. It's a family, not a blood, but a belief. A family we call the Christian church.
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last breath.
The 13th station. Jesus dies on the cross. In Luke's gospel, Jesus' life ends with a prayer. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." This is not a prayer of abandonment or fear, but a prayer of confidence. Jesus is now totally with God.
When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. He then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and went away.
Jesus is dead. Joseph, a rich man from the town of Arimathea, asked Pilate to give him Jesus' body. Joseph takes Jesus' body, prepares it for burial, and lays it in a new tomb, one that he has hewn out of the rock himself. Matthew presents Joseph as a disciple of Jesus. Not one of the 12, of course, but also not a member of those who had put Jesus to death. Matthew also makes Joseph wealthy and presents the tomb as both new and made by Joseph himself. Matthew is making a point here. Jesus is not buried in an unmarked tomb somewhere by a former enemy. Jesus is buried by one of his followers, someone who loved Jesus enough to dig a new tomb himself for Jesus, and everyone will know exactly where Jesus is buried. With Jesus in the tomb, the Stations of the Cross traditionally end. They are not a resurrection story. They are a prayerful journey, a devotion, helping us to see anew the sacrifice that Jesus made for us all. However, we know this is not the end of this story. St. Matthew records it this way: "Do not be afraid. Jesus is not here. He has been raised, just as he said he would be. Jesus is our risen Lord and Savior. Now, go tell others."
We're glad you've been with us for this special edition of Sanctuary on the Stations of the Cross. Email us at gcbm@ameritech.net, visit our website at gcbm.org, and write to us at Sanctuary, in care of the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries, 77 West Washington Street, Chicago 60602. I'm Lydia Talbot. Thanks for keeping faith with us today on Sanctuary. May peace be with you.
Thank you.